Alright, so the finale of Season 3 is looming ever nearer, and regardless of how I feel about the episode prior to this one, it was a more serious episode with a more serious tone, and so in the grand tradition of this show, this episode and the one after it are going to be a bit of levity leading into the finale. They're going to be more comedy-oriented episodes. This week's episode, Can We Keep Him?, is about a character who you might recognize from Teen Titans Go if you hate yourself enough to actually watch it regularly. Yes, this episode is the introduction of Silky, the team pet. And I genuinely didn't remember that he started out as Beast Boy's pet. I've just, in my mind, always associated him with Starfire. I guess I didn't see this episode enough in reruns to really recall that he actually starts out as Beast Boy's pet. There's a fight at the beginning of this episode between the Titans and a returned Johnny Rancid, now with a robot dog monster named Rex at his side. He's wreaking havoc, spurring Rex on to eat random bystanders, which is a little more hardcore than the show usually goes, but okay. As weird as it is to say, Vor is kind of a theme of this comedy-driven episode. Make of that what you will. But anyway, the Titans do show up to confront Rancid and Rex, and it's a pretty good fight, showcasing the Titans' powers in a fight that they're not gonna lose it, even if they really drop the ball. Like, yeah, Beast Boy has a Beast Boy moment, and Johnny gets away, but even then, you're never really worried that he's gonna come back as a larger threat, or at least not one large enough to really challenge this team. However, when they do return to the tower to try to use the tech there to locate Johnny, they find the entire tower torn up, and bits and pieces of things throughout the living space chewed on and eaten up as if a dog had been chewing at the furniture or something. This prompts Beast Boy to take Starfire aside, taking advantage of the fact that she's so caring and doesn't want to let her friends down, to convince her to look after his pet, one of the worms created by, I wouldn't say Hawk Moth, it's Killer Moth, from that episode with the spider-headed guy that I hate so much. Beast Boy has apparently been successfully keeping this thing as his pet in secret ever since that particular occurrence, and I have trouble believing that because this is Beast Boy, but okay, whatever. And at first Starfire is not on board with this because it is an icky bug, but it's also a pretty cute icky bug. It's kind of like a fat pink Caterpie or something. And so she does take to it pretty quickly. She had mentioned during the fight with Rex that even particularly lively and fierce animals are just considered rambunctious pets back on Tamaran. So of course a freaky monster thing isn't really going to freak her out all that much. And she bonds with this thing, and this is the part of the episode that I remembered the best before going back to rewatch it here, which is why I just kind of always assumed that Silky was always her pet, because the rest of the episode treats him like her pet. Like, I don't even think Beast Boy comments on Silky again throughout the rest of the episode. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I missed something, but I don't recall a single moment of him actually commenting on Silky's existence in any fashion throughout the rest of this entire episode.
That's Silky? Dude, what have you been feeding him?
Something is definitely up with Silky, though. He did cause the damage to the tower, and now he doesn't seem to want to eat anything until Starfire gives him some weird tamarinian berries that she says are like extremely bitter or something. They sound really unappetizing, like most tamarinian things do, but Silky eats them up, and unfortunately they cause him to mutate into a giant Silky, who then burrows through the tower, comes across Cyborg, and eats Cyborg's leg. Yes, I did tell you, I did warn you that Vor was a theme of this comedy-driven episode of a children's cartoon. So, for the majority of the rest of the episode, Cyborg's actually limping along on this, like, scrawny temporary leg. It's really funny. Like, this entire episode's really funny. I laughed out loud more often than I usually do when watching a Teen Titans episode. This one I found particularly funny. And I'm honestly not sure why. I'm going to do my best to kind of work out why at the end of the review. Now that everyone else is aware of Silky, though, they make Starfire take him away and find an isolated place for him to live and then leave him there. So she has this heartfelt moment where she says goodbye to this creature that she has only known for the better part of a single day, as if this is her lifelong pet and she is having to put it out to pasture or whatever. And it is relatively soon after this that Johnny Rancid returns with Rexzilla, a larger robot, which is now, it's got kind of the same face that Rex had, but it's T-Rex shaped, it's bigger, it's got artillery in it, and it looks like Johnny Rancid is actually going to round out the episode as the big villain. And despite the fact that even Rexzilla doesn't strike me as the kind of thing that the Titans would really have trouble with. But then, out of nowhere, Silky, who is now mutated fully into a moth, a full-fledged giant moth, swoops down and eats Johnny and Rexzilla. And lo and behold, Killer Moth has ridden him into battle. He has tracked him down and found him. This is his larva, M319, I think is what he called it, or something along those lines. He actually recognizes which mutant larva experiment Silky was originally. And he and Silky fight against the Titans. And again, this is the kind of enemy that I never really expected the Titans to have trouble with. And they don't really. Robin tries to fight Killer Moth directly and gets blindsided by Silky at one point, but that's really the most trouble that Silky actually gives them. It's pretty clear that if they were just working together and going all out, Killer Moth and Silky would have been taken down pretty quickly. They only really have as much trouble as they do because Starfire at one point hesitates to attack Silky when Raven has him pinned. And again, Beast Boy says absolutely nothing through this entire fight. He doesn't attack Silky either, but he doesn't protest to Silky being attacked by the others. He doesn't try to protect Silky the way that Starfire does a couple of times. And at the end, when Silky and Killer Moth are separated, and Killer Moth is calling for Silky from one side, it's Starfire on the other side, trying to call him back to her and not Beast Boy. It makes me question why it couldn't have just been Starfire who was the person who kept Silky. Maybe she found him as they were searching the tower for whatever was eating things. Maybe he had been living there kind of in the ventilation or something ever since the thing with Killer Moth originally, and she finds him and bonds with him. I don't know why Beast Boy had to be his original owner. It doesn't work for me, because after that, as I've said, Beast Boy shows absolutely no emotional investment in this creature whatsoever. It makes the scene superfluous, and I think it would be better, like thematically speaking, if it had been reworked so that Starfire was the one who found him. Like, you could say that maybe if she had only found him that day, she wouldn't have had time to really become emotionally attached to him. Maybe her emotional attachment to him was kickstarted by the fact that she knew Beast Boy cared about him. But, I mean, we don't really see any evidence of that. We see her bonding with him. We see how she bonded with him. So why couldn't she have just done that in under a day normally, finding him herself and then bonding with him normally over the course of that day? I guess the scene where Beast Boy tries to convince her to look after Silky for a while has a bit of a comedic element to it that works fairly well, but that's the only reason I can think of why it's there. This scene, though, where you have the protagonist and the antagonist both calling to the pet, doesn't go the cliche route with Silky returning to Starfire. It actually leads to what I think is the funniest moment of the entire episode. Silky straight up explodes into pink goo that's roughly the same color as the weird Tamaranian berries. Johnny Rancid is laying amongst this pink goo. He remarks that he was eaten in a very funny way. I laughed out loud at that, too. They managed to get Johnny and Killer Moth chained up. Meanwhile, Starfire, not Beast Boy and Starfire, but just Starfire, is lamenting the fact that this creature that she just met that day, or maybe it was the previous day at this point, has seemingly died. But then she finds a regular-sized Silky within the pink goo, and it turns out he was just molting. I guess occasionally he will get a weird appetite, eat a bunch of random stuff, then lose his appetite and molt, and we even see why during that stage where apparently he isn't supposed to have an appetite anymore, he would have eaten those tamaranian berries, because apparently after one of these creatures molts, it eats the molt, and the molt tastes like the berries. So Silky eats his own remains. And Starfire, when she realizes that those remains taste like the berries, eats his remains along with him. I'm just going to move on. Despite some weird, and I do mean weird, theming in this episode, this is a really funny comedy episode that manages to work in some good action. The fight with Johnny Rancid at the beginning, the fight with Killer Moth at the end, were both really good, visually dynamic fights, where the Titans didn't feel like they were taking it seriously, but that's because there was really no reason for them to. It was fine for them to hold back a little bit and make sure they didn't cause a bunch of collateral damage or whatever. And hell, even have a little bit of fun with the fights too. Fun is important, after all. And I think the reason why the comedy in this episode in particular really works for me, whereas comedy elsewhere in the series I only find okay on average. Like, there are definitely episodes that I find funnier than others, but comedy in this show I find only okay on average. I think the reason why it really stood out here, though, is because Starfire is a funny character. The kind of humor that they convey through her characterization, through her quirks, that's just the kind of humor that speaks to me. I guess there's a lot of randomness there, but it's not so random that it's stupid. It's still character driven. The comedy centered around Starfire is still character driven, but there can be a really striking random element to it because of her alien nature. And in fact, the writers clearly understood that, as she uses her alien nature a couple of times to cover up things that Silky had done, which might have given him away. And that's what actually got the biggest laughs out of me. The fact that Starfire is apparently more self-aware than I realized, that I think people were supposed to have realized at this point in the show, about how weird and quirky she can actually be, and took advantage of that to deceive her friends, which is just out of character enough that when spun for comedy, it really works. I honestly can't remember if we see Silky again in the show in anything other than like a background capacity or anything. I'll have to keep an eye out for that. But as far as cartoon pets go, he's pretty different, interesting. I compared him to a Caterpie earlier, so let's go back to Pokemon as an example. It's kind of like if instead of Pikachu becoming the mascot of Pokemon, Weedle had, or Caterpie had. I still think something like that could have worked, but I mean, bugs just in general aren't as cute as mammals, or at least people don't find them to be as cute as mammals, so it still would have been weird. I guess what it really boils down to is that this episode is an example of, I think, probably the weirdest the humor in this show ever gets, and yet it still shows how strong the writing in this show can be, because they managed to make that weirdness work for the comedy rather than against it. As per usual though, guys, I'd like to know, what do you think of the episode Can I Keep In? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over in my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.